but I'm Robert Romero with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Service, prior agent with the Fish and Wildlife, excuse me, Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, prior agent with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I will introduce our speaker here today. It is Adrienne Reese. She's out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and is a special agent with the Fish and Wildlife Service, here to talk today with us about the Lacie Act and its benefit in Indian country. So Adrienne, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for attending. We'll go ahead and dive right into the Lacie Act. This is a great law, lots of uses, but it can be pretty complicated to follow and apply. So we'll go through it a little bit and try to give you a better understanding of what it is and how it applies. So this is some of the basic language of what the Lacie Act is. And basically the Lacie Act is a two-step law. So we need to hit on two different sections. So the first being a unlawful act that includes an import, export, sale, acquire, purchase, take of a fish, wildlife, or plant. And this is made unlawful by a violation that could be a federal law, state law, tribal law, a foreign law, and then a transport, movement, or secondary act of that particular wildlife item. And that's what we need to meet the elements of Lacie Act. So we'll go in and kind of break that down a little bit more. We'll start with the history of it. So Lacie Act was enacted in the 1900 by Congressman John Lacy. And this is a time period where wildlife populations had been severely decimated by commercial activity, by expansion. And so states and territories had begun to recognize that and enact laws that protected this wildlife. But the issue was that when the wildlife was removed from that state, there was no protection, and that state lost enforcement ability on that violation. And additionally, a lot of times the movement would be, someone might go out and kill buffalo or birds and ship them to a separate state, and they could put in shipping containers and mark it as, fine china or something different. And there was no violation against falsely labeling your items. So, and then there was also a lot of injurious species or non-native species that were being introduced, mongoose, passenger pigeons, different things that were wreaking havoc on local areas and local wildlife. So why Lacie was enacted was to combat this activity. So basically close that gap where a state would have the illegal activity in one state would carry to the next state. And the shipment of that illegal product could be tracked and could be enforced in any other state that it went through. And those same laws would apply to both wildlife that was illegally taken and wildlife that was being brought in that did not belong in a certain area. So this, again, the purpose of the law was to apply to both a wider range of types of wildlife and a wider range of different laws. And it's expanded over time to include not only states, tribal laws, but also foreign laws, any protections of these wildlife and the movements of them was expanded and covered. So it's a very broad law. And it holds very stiff penalties. Wildlife laws don't necessarily have large penalties, but Lacie Act is one of the ones that carry more weight in the penalty department. So we're going to get into some of the definitions to kind of help you better understand this law and how it applies. So when we're talking about a fish or wildlife, we're talking about any wild animal, and it doesn't matter if that animal is alive or dead, It doesn't matter what it is as long as it holds a protection and it is a wild animal. It doesn't matter how it came into the world, whether it was bred or in captivity or in the wild. And when we're talking about plants, we're talking about any member of the plant kingdom. And this can be a tree, this can be bark, this can be roots and seeds. And with wildlife, it's the same thing. It can be any part of that wildlife. But back to plants, any roots and any seeds, plants do have exceptions and exclusions. And basically what that is this is any protected wild animal. It does not, or I'm sorry, wild plant. It does not include crops, like food crops. But it does include food crops, or it does include crops if those crops are an endangered species listed plant crop or a CITES listed crop if it's being imported or exported. And CITES is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. You're not really going to deal with that unless you're dealing with import-export, but those are the exceptions to the plant rule. So with taken is a capture, kill, or collection of that wildlife or that plant. And it's important to note with taken under Lacie, when you're dealing with different wildlife laws, there's different definitions of taken. So if you're dealing with Endangered Species Act or Marine Mammal Protection Act, taken can include hunted pursuit, harassment, or harm of that wildlife. And it's important to understand that under Lacie, those don't apply. And the Lacie definition of taken only applies to the capture of the wildlife, the killing of the wildlife, or the collection of the wildlife. And when it comes to sell, this is any monetary exchange, currency, or any monetary gain for any service or any exchange of an illegal wildlife product. So that can be guiding, that can be a hunting and fishing license, or simply purchasing it. And under purchase, it's the act both of selling it and purchasing it, whether that be the wildlife itself or it be a guiding service or a hunting service. Both the sale and the purchase are violations. And then the transport is any activity that causes the movement of that wildlife. So whether they're physically moving it, whether they're shipping it, putting it in the mail, they're putting it on, a moving van and sending it somewhere. It's the act of causing the movement of that wildlife. And then when it comes to the laws and treaties that apply the underlying law, it just needs to be a law that is covered by the tribe, and the tribe needs to be defined under section rule 1151, title 18, which basically says a federally recognized tribe or a tribe that is recognized by the government. And the law needs to be wildlife specific. So it needs to have wildlife protection as its focus. So this is kind of a breakdown. Again, Lacey, it's a large law. There's a lot of different aspects to it, but the ones that you will likely deal with in Indian country are the section 337(2)(a)(1), which applies to the act of taking. The act of basically trafficking is the kind of commercial aspect of the movement of that item. So the illegal take, whether it's individual or for commercial, in violation of a federal or tribal law. And then 3372C, which applies to the sale or purchase as it relates to guiding services and the sale or exchange of permits or tags. So for the breaking down the steps. So the first underlying law, the first step, we can use federal law, state law, foreign tribal law. So this can break down to your specific wildlife protection laws for each tribe. This can break down to specific federal laws, including Endangered Species Act, including Migratory Bird Treaty Act or Balding Bull Eagle Protection Act, but the violation of one or any of those laws that apply to wildlife protections. The validity of that law needs to stand on its own. It has to be a strong law that that's why we like to go off a lot of times the lack of a permit in hunting, because if we're mixing in a law that doesn't stand well on its own in that initial step, we're going to run into trouble. And I think did you put up a link on different applications of that? So, and that's another resource to look at.
I just added a link in the chat to for the Lacie Act.
Perfect. Yeah. So that'll be a good reference for it as well. But yeah, we need to make sure that underlying law can stand on its own validity. And as we're charging these Lacie Acts, the step 1 and the step 2 doesn't necessarily have to occur by the same individual. So we would see this guiding services. A guide is paid for an illegal hunt. The client kills the animal and the client transports the animal. That guide is still liable, even though they're not the one who produced or who did the actual transport of the animal. So we're going to kind of further break down the meaning of each of these items in this step. So we already kind of covered taken as it applies to hunt or to kill, capture, or collect. When we look at possession, you can look at this as that someone who's not meant to or isn't allowed to be in possession of that specific item. So maybe you make a traffic stop and there's someone who has an untagged deer or someone who has sheds without a permit, or they have a Gila monster without a permit, or they don't have a collection permit on that. So you've got illegal possession. You don't know that necessarily that individual did the taking of that, but you know that they are in possession. So you're built on building blocks to build to a Lacy case. Transport, a lot of times you're going to see, and it's doubled up here. You see these same words in step 1 and step 2, and what this does is kind of broaden our ability to enforce this and to include different ways to enforce it. But we can't double this up. So you see transport on step 1 and step 2. We can't use transport and transport when we're applying these steps. It has to be 2 separate things. It has to be a take and a transport. It has to be a possession and a transport. But I'll get into transport a little bit more in step 2 because that tends to be the most often way that you're going to see it applied. So when it comes to sell, we went over that as well. It's a monetary exchange, currency or exchange for a service or for a wildlife item. And these, again, would fall under the underlying law of the location of where it happened or the federal law that would follow it. So in step 2, we've got basically an act of movement, an import or export that'll apply to international movement of that item. Transport, when we're looking at transport under this, what constitutes transport is going to depend quite a bit on what that underlying law is. So in Indian country, you're very lucky in that transport is any movement of that wildlife. So if an individual goes out and shoots a deer without a tag and then takes it home, or they pick it up and put it in the back of their truck, you've got a Lacie Act. We need the knowledge aspect, which we'll get into in the next slides, but proving Lacie on tribal land is of the easiest steps in Lacie, or at least the lowest amount of required transport. Because when we're dealing with a state violation, that transport happens when that wildlife crosses state lines. And same thing with a federal violation. If it's a federal law violation, as soon as that wildlife is transported across state lines, it is enacted. There is some variation in this if it's like Forest Service land or BLM land, other types of federal land, and it's a violation of that federal statute, then the transport of that item from federal land to state land, or from federal land to whatever land is it's transported to, would enact Lacie. And then when we're dealing with, again, we kind of cover sold, we'll go into again, outfitting example when we look at the receive, acquire, purchase to kind of better understand those steps as we were talking. So say that you have an outfitter that illegally guides someone who illegally takes an animal, that the client who conducts that activity, who receives that service, who gets that wildlife item and takes it home with them, transports that wildlife item. Both the sale of the outfitter, the purchase of the service, and the acquired movement of that wildlife item is what would constitute the Lacie action, and it would bind those two together and both having violated the Lacie Act. And the question, how do you handle an animal that the state considers open season on, but tribes charge for hunting it? If you see someone with one, how would you proceed? So you're saying that the tribe charges hunting for it. So does the tribe require tags and a hunting license for it?
Talani, if you want to unmute your mic, you can go ahead and open discussion on it. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I didn't want to interrupt because you were going so good, but it just brought to mind. So we have Himalayan tar in New Mexico, and several of the tribes like Laguna and Acoma, I think, both charge for somebody to hunt Himalayan tar, but yet the state of New Mexico calls them an invasive species, and it's open season. You don't have to have a permit. You kill them if you see them. So how would you proceed if you had somebody that was maybe coming off tribal lands, or you saw them driving near tribal lands with a dead tar? How would that work? So
it would all depend on where it was taken and where the movement occurs, and how the tribe defines it. So if the tribe charges for hunting it, but the tribe does not define it as wildlife with the tribe, it doesn't constitute and it doesn't constitute, and it doesn't a situation like that would pretty much more apply to hunting on Indian lands. I don't remember the exact statute on that, but if we were to get involved with that, we probably wouldn't go forward with Lacie because it's got a questionable definition of wildlife. But it would be a violation of a hunting law, which would fall under the federal statute of hunting on Indian lands. Does that make sense?
Okay, and that's what I was trying to get at, is whether it was Lacie or whether it would be something else. So
yeah,
okay.
it would fall in, unless the tribe within the tribal laws and statutes defines it differently as wildlife, which they probably don't. I think they're pretty in line with the state definitions, but they do allow the hunting of it, and that just falls under the tribal hunting laws.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me. It's a lot of information I'm throwing at you, so I will answer them as they come in. So getting back, so yeah, if you're dealing with a outfitter and a client, even though the outfitter isn't the one that's actually transporting the wildlife, they're both culpable for it. So again, as we were saying, we need to prove knowledge with all of this as well. So, and the level of knowledge we have to prove will vary based on when we're trying to enforce a felony versus a misdemeanor. So at its basis, we definitely need to prove that the individual knew that they were performing the first act, whether it's take, whether it's sale, whatever it is, we need to prove that they knew they were not supposed to be performing that action. And then we also need to prove that they knew they couldn't transport, or they couldn't do that second step of movement of that wildlife item. And we'll generally need that for felony level. And within that knowledge, the proving of that knowledge, we've got knowing and should have known. And we'll break that down a little bit more too. But again, we need knowingly knowing, which is basically knowing step 1 and step 2 to prove a felony. And we just need basic knowing, which is sufficient to enforce a misdemeanor. So on that, when we're proving it, when it comes to that initial phase, so you've got someone who is illegally taken wildlife, and you need to prove the knowledge aspect. There's different ways that we can do that depending on how it's being applied. So if you look in, you've got this individual who's legally taken wildlife, and you speak to the local state warden, and they say, oh yeah, they were convicted through the state for that 5 years ago, then they have knowledge of that because they've been convicted of it in the past. And even if it's criminal or civil, if they have received a violation notice for it, any type of action for the same type of offense or wildlife offenses, you've got that they knew the action was illegal. If they've had any contacts, like if they've called, your office and asked if those actions are illegal, then you know that they have knowledge because your office has informed them of it. If you've done an interview on them, they say, yeah, I knew I shouldn't have done that. You've got your knowledge aspect. If they were hunting with their brother and their brother says, oh yeah, he knew he shouldn't have done that, then you've got your knowledge. And then if you look back through tribal tags, or you look back through state tags, and you know that individual has had applied for or had tags or licenses in the past, then they have knowledge. If it's an outfitter and the outfitter has gone to the Forest Service and applied for a special use permit for outfitting, then they know the laws regarding outfitting. And if they've made inquiries to your office or any other office that you can document regarding those actions, and they've been told that those actions are illegal. If you have anything that shows they've engaged in similar activity before, if they were contacted by one of your officers in the field, and you've got logs of that, and they were out and they were given a warning, well, you've got, they understand that activity is illegal. And if they've gone to maybe like a town hall meeting and complained about how strict the laws are, and you've got log of that, then that they do that illegal, that action was illegal. Or they're on like Big Muley's Facebook page, they've got a knowledge of the wildlife laws as they apply to them. So again, when we're analyzing these types of cases, we need to make sure that we can articulate and clearly show the acts of step 1 and step 2. So we want to make sure that without a doubt, there is a violation of that first underlying law, that first tribal law, that first federal law, whatever it is. We need to be able to ensure that that law was broken without a doubt. And in step 2, we need to make sure that we can clearly show that that law was broken and that there was a secondary action, being a transport, a sell, an import, whatever it may be of that wildlife, that it was enacted by step 1. And you know that step 1 action generally is going to happen before step 2. So you're not often going to have, you know, a guy that drives a truck full of deer into a field and shoots them and then drives them away. You're not going to see stuff like that very often. So you're going to see step 1 most often happening before step 2, or the basic transport element. And again, we kind of went over it. You know, it doesn't necessarily, the transport of it doesn't necessarily have to be conducted by the person who originally did step 1, the illegal act in step 1. But we do need to make sure that we're proving the knowledge of those individuals. And this is kind of a table that breaks down a little bit more of this information as it applies to felony level offenses versus misdemeanor level offenses. So we have a step 1 application of take possession, transport, or sell in violation of whatever the underlying law is, and then the knowing movement of that, or the knowingly action that follows in step 2. And when we have those things, when we can prove knowledge in step 1, and we can prove, or we have knowledge in step 1, and we have an act that includes an import or export, which is something in and out of the country. And you're probably not going to see this very often if you're a park that is on a international, or I'm sorry, if you're a tribe on an international border. You might see some of this, but for the most part, you're not going to see a lot of import export. But there is a automatic felony with the import export if you've got the knowledge and the committing of step 1. And then if we've got knowledge proven in step 1, and you have knowledge of both step 1 and step 2, and there is a commercial transaction that is valued at more than $350, you've got felony level. And then if you've got knowledge or should have known, and a violation that is valued at less than $350, then you've got a misdemeanor. So with the applications, again, the protections of native wildlife falls mainly on the tribes, the state, whoever controls that area. But if those laws seem to not hold the penalty level that you feel that it needs, if more action needs to be taken, if you've got repeat offenders, if you've got just a special case that needs more than what your tribal laws can offer, then this is a great tool to use and a great opportunity to do joint investigations with us regarding these Lacie Act violations. But we don't want to, a lot of times it's not as effective when you're dealing with like unintentional violators, you know, the first time hunter that just should have known, but you know, you slap him with some tribal violations and that's going to scare him out of that activity and not make him do it again, then he's not necessarily the best candidate. But you know, if that individual then does it over and over again, then you're definitely in a good spot to try to push for a Lacy case. And I wanted to break down some of the different types of things that you might run into based on states that you might be in, and what we've seen and dealt with out of these different areas. And this doesn't necessarily just include the state. So when it comes to reptile poaching, this could be Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, or California, wherever you may be, but you might run into this as we've seen quite a bit of people that will travel internationally to collect reptiles from these areas. These reptiles are highly valued in other countries or other parts of the country. We have Germans that will fly in and go on trips throughout the Southwest to collect reptiles. So if you have, someone that's pulled off to the side of one of your roads and they're doing weird things and you can't really figure out exactly what's going on, there's a possibility that depending on the time of year and what they say and what they've got going on, they could be collecting reptiles. So we've got a couple pictures of some different things that you might see with reptile collectors. They'll have books, they'll have GPSs, they'll have these strange tools, bags at which they keep these little white bags, or you often see, and they'll keep the reptiles in those bags, and then they'll have nets. And so that can be a buildup for a Lacy case if the collection of those reptiles are prohibited within your tribe. And then in Texas, bighorn sheep heads are highly valued. So there's a lot of poaching of them, a lot of movement of those heads. So if that's something that's in your area, definitely something to consider. And again, some of the reptiles within Texas are highly desired. And so you may see people trying to collect those illegally. Colorado has a lot of commercial markets for wildlife products. And so you're going to see a lot of, or there can be a lot of movement of those products that need to be properly labeled as they leave the state and go wherever they may be being sold. So you've got marking offenses that you may or may not run into, but something to consider. And then it's also prime hunting and trapping territory. So there's a lot of hunters and trappers coming in, and then there's a lot of industry. There's wind power that can affect MBT and bald and gold eagle. And again, all these things can translate to other states as well. And then New Mexico, we've got a large concentration of tribes here with some prime hunting lands. So we'll definitely have the opportunity to run into hunting violations, outfitter violations. And we also have endangered species here. Again, we've got that wolf there, that the wolves move around and may end up on some of the tribal lands. And we've got the main ESA violation in that, but there's potential for Lacy as well. So we'll go into a couple examples of applications of Lacy. So you've got an individual, Frank, and he goes out and he kills a deer in violation of tribal law. And then Frank takes the deer home, and Frank knows he shouldn't have killed the deer, and he knows he shouldn't have taken the deer home. This is a misdemeanor violation. He knows he committed step 1 and step 2, but there's no commercial value in this. There's no import export. So you've got a misdemeanor level offense of Lacy here. So you've got Bill, he draws an elk tag. He's not going to use it. So he goes to Jill and says, I will sell you this elk tag and I will guide you in killing this elk. And Jill says, okay, and goes out and pays Bill $350. And she shoots an elk and she takes it home to Texas or wherever she resides. Bill and Jill knew that they shouldn't have exchanged the tag and the guiding services. And they knew they shouldn't have, or Jill knew she shouldn't have taken that elk home with her. So you've got a transaction that's over $350. And you've got knowledge in both step 1 and step 2. So you've got a felony there. So, and again, going back to making sure what we can prove about these violations, we've got beyond a reasonable doubt that the violation in step 1 has occurred, and that take possession sale has occurred in step 1, and that we can clearly show that step 2 occurred. Again, in an Indian country where that transport is automatically enacted when the movement of that wildlife happens, those clear articulations of step 2 are a lot easier. And then, of course, we need to prove that the defendant had knowledge of those actions, or should have known, being that, you know, they've previously had tags for hunting, or, you know, if they're collecting reptiles, that they, you know, maybe they have a state collection permit, but they don't have a tribal collection permit. So we do run into a lot of legal challenges with Lacy. As you can see through this presentation, it's a large, confusing, complicated law. And so it's poorly understood by AUSA. So there's a lot of caution used when applying this. So AUSAs are going to look at it, and they're going to err on the side of caution when they're dealing with these violations. And it is not a law that is heavily enforced in courts. So the case law is not stacked. So there is a strong possibility that your case can be challenged. There's a lot of openings for defense to challenge different aspects of it. And so we could end up creating some poor case law, and no one wants to be the guy that creates poor case law. So we've got to make sure, again, that we've got a solid case when we move forward with these. And again, it's a broad law. So it allows us to enforce a lot of different types of laws, a lot of different types of ways. And with that, there's a lot of interpretation that can be added in. And there's interpretations can be added in from every aspect. So from the very beginning, and the regulation is going to be interpreted, the case law is going to be interpreted. There's a lot of different ways that these different fractions can look at one word and interpret it a different way. So we've got to keep that in mind, that these cases can change quickly, can move forward or not based on the way that a certain section is going to interpret the way those laws apply. And then agency policy is going to affect it. We've got Fish and Wildlife has a Morton Policy, so that affects feathers, who can and can't possess them, what can be done with them. McKittrick Policy, that affects endangered species and species that are similar to endangered species. So black bears and brown bears, one's protected, one's not, but they're not easy to tell the difference between. A wolf and a coyote, it's not easy to tell the difference between it. So when someone takes one of them, then you've got the defense of McKittrick, which is basically you didn't know the difference because they're very similar, and you didn't necessarily have the intent to kill an endangered species. You thought it was a coyote, or you thought it was a brown or a black bear. And then MBTA is a law that it can change a lot. There's amendments to it. The way it's enforced has changed. So when you're using these things, ESA, MBTA, Bald Legal Protection Act, the policy application and the changes in the way that law is being enforced at that time can affect your ability to use it as an underlying law for Lacy. So with Lacy, Lacy is subject to CAFRA, which is Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act, which basically gives the government the ability to seek forfeiture of items that are involved in a crime. So if you've dealt with us before, if you've done any cases with Fish and Wildlife before, say it's an Endangered Species Act case or a Migratory Bird Treaty Act case, and we are seizing wildlife, we're going to seek an abandonment of that wildlife from the defendant. And that is because under those violations, we do not have CAFRA. So we cannot seek forfeiture of them. We have to get them abandoned. Later in the processing, we can, but our process is usually to seek the abandonment immediately. But under Lacy, we do get a conviction on this, then we can, within the legal documents, require the forfeiture of the wildlife involved. And if it's a felony level conviction, say it's an outfitter that's conducted a felony level offense, and they've used different types of property, vehicles, guns, whatever it may be, as part of that crime, then we can seek forfeiture of whatever items we can prove were used in the processing or the act of that crime. And this is a breakdown of some of the penalties with Lacy. Again, it carries a larger max penalty than a lot of our wildlife crimes. Felony, you can get up to 5 years imprisonment, 250,000 from an individual and 500,000 from an organization. We generally don't get the max penalties on this very often, but this is what we could technically get. Class A misdemeanors, we got 1 year imprisonment up to, and 100,000 from an individual or 200,000 from an organization. With these, we can force it criminally or civilly. We can seek up to 25,409 for a civil action. Marking offense, again, those are, you're seeing those more with import export. And then with all that, of course, we've got the knowledge aspect. Is there any questions?
So Adrian, I do have one that came up, and I'll repost it. Let me copy it. Well, actually, I'll just read it to you. Okay, the question is, would the Lacie Act apply to land access? So in a situation where tribes do have private land that they manage, and they're managing those private lands for the benefit of the tribe, but do allow hunters with state permits to come in and hunt there, would the Lacie Act apply if a state permitted hunter hunts and takes takes wildlife on tribal owned private land, where the tribe does allow access to state permitted hunters to hunt there, if the hunter did not obtain permission to access the land? Does that make sense?
Yes. That's a hard one to say because there's a lot of different things that go into it. And again, there's a lot of different interpretations on it. But that initial hunt, if that hunt is allowed on that, or it's allowed on that land, but the take is in violation because the permission didn't occur, but the land itself is deemed a legal hunting area. It depends on how the statute of the tribe is written as far as how the access is granted and used. So that would be one that would be, we would require a lot more access. It's hard to answer that one. If you've got a situation with that happening, I'll give you my contact information after, and we'll try to dig into it a little bit more, but that one's kind of hard to answer exactly without a little bit more on exactly how the tribe writes that law or writes how that access is granted.
Understood. And so I think what you're saying is that it just depends on what the tribal law states, what the regulations state, and whether or not that underlying law would be wildlife related.
Yeah, so it's both the relation to wildlife and again, we went over the validity of it. So we have to make sure that we're solid in the application of that law and how it affects creating a situation where that hunt would go from illegal to legal to illegal. So we've got to prove the aspects of that being solid before we were to do a Lacie Act case on something like that.
Okay, thank you. For everyone, we have 15 minutes before this session is over. So those of you that have questions, you can either raise your hand and I can, or just go ahead and unmute yourself. Actually, that'd be the easiest. Go ahead and unmute yourself and present your question.
And I'm going to scroll down. This is my contact information. If you think of something after, just have any questions or anything afterwards. And then I'm out of Albuquerque and I cover the northern half of New Mexico. If you have a case where you think could be Lacy, you have any questions, but you're not in that area, you still feel free to reach out to me. And if you need to try to get contacts for whatever agent might be in your particular area, feel free to reach out as well, and I will get you in touch with whoever that might be.
So Adrian, I have a question that's for the benefit of the group, but you mentioned seizures, the wildlife and any equipment used in the violation. If tribal officers do seize equipment, including personal cell phones, personal computers, other electronic devices and such, how would the Fourth Amendment apply to those types of items? And what precautions should they use when dealing with those items?
And that's a great question. So when you're dealing with that, say you've got a case where you've got an outfitter and you've got some clear violations initially, make sure that you're using proper Fourth Amendment search and seizure when you're taking those items. If you're combining with us, make sure that we've got clear documentation of how that occurred. So say there's binoculars in a car and you get a consent search for that car, or you get a warrant for that car and you seize that item, you may seize the car as well. We need to make sure that all is documented and we see that. And if you are seeking to, you want to keep that as part of the case, we can add it in as part of the legal process afterwards. We just got to make sure that all the law is applied throughout the process. And then if we seek for forfeiture, then often we can make sure that it's written that it goes back to the tribe. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, just initially when you do see something, just to make sure that you don't violate anybody's reasonable expectation of privacy for those items. That's all. And I know,
and we'll go into that a little
later
bit
on. Yeah, I was just going to say that. Deliven, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in real quick, Robert and Adrian. One of the issues we've had is like cell phones. Cell phones are kind of, we know there's a lot of evidence a lot of times on those devices. But as the officer that's running the investigation, remember, we always got to have probable cause as to why we took that item. So if there's no probable cause, or we can't prove that the cell phone was used in the crime, we really shouldn't take that device and try to search it without having the proper search warrants and stuff. So remember, probable cause is always key to any of the items that we're seizing. So just my 2 cents on that question that Robert mentioned.
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion points from anyone? So Adrian, actually, I'm going to stop sharing your screen real quick so I can share mine. But what I wanted to do was just share a map of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society's regions. And I meant to share this earlier with Phil during his discussion, but you can see right here where the Southwest region encompasses. So we've got obviously Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and part of California. If anybody here is on the phone in those outside regions, excuse me, if anybody on this meeting is representing any of these other states, can they call you guys to then get information as to their contacts in these other 4?
Yeah, absolutely. So our regional boundaries are pretty similar, and we're going to have a lot quicker response and getting you resources. If you're within our region, we'll definitely reach out and get you what you need from those other areas, and we'll refer you to someone who will be in your area to help out, or if there's a specific issue going on that we don't have great knowledge on, then we can definitely set you up with whoever might be in that area.
Appreciate that. I don't know if you want to put your information back up, but again, we've got about 10 minutes. Feel free to ask questions. Adrian's in the hot seat. She's ready.
And thank you for having us on, and thank you all for participating and listening in.
Yeah, appreciate that, Adrian. Appreciate the presentation. It's great. I'm sorry, I did leave add the link for the Lacie Act. It's available through the society website as well under resources for laws and regulations. So you can find it there as well if you didn't pick it up off the chat. This afternoon, we'll have more presentations from the Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement. But if there are no other questions, we can kind of just move into our lunch break. And the lunch break will be for a little bit over an hour now. So we've got an hour and 10 minutes. Our next presentation will start at 12 p.m. Arizona time. And it will be on evidence collection and security and the chain of custody, and that'll be presented by Bobby Fortiz with Fish and Wildlife. Appreciate everybody's time, and we'll see you this afternoon.